Jake Morrison stood at the edge of the cliff, the Montana wind whipping through his dark hair as he stared down at the valley where his life had shattered 18 months ago. The twisted metal guardrail still bore scars from that rainy night, when everything changed forever. His calloused hands gripped the fence post until his knuckles turned white, the weight of grief pressing down on his broad shoulders like a physical force. Behind him, the Morrison Ranch stretched across the foothills, 2,000 acres of prime cattle land that felt more like a prison than a home these days. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The sound of small footsteps on gravel made him turn. Tommy, his 8-year-old son, approached with the careful steps of a child who had learned too young that the world could break without warning. The boy's sandy hair caught the late afternoon light, and his blue eyes held a seriousness that no child should carry. "Dad," Tommy said quietly, his voice barely audible above the mountain breeze. "Lily's asking for dinner again." Jake closed his eyes for a moment, pushing down the familiar wave of inadequacy that crashed over him whenever his children needed something he felt incapable of providing. Claire had been the heart of their home, the one who could calm Lily's nightmares and coax smiles from Tommy even on his darkest days. Without her, Jake felt like he was drowning in responsibilities he'd never learned to handle alone. "Tell her I'll be right there," he managed, his voice rougher than intended. Tommy nodded but didn't move immediately. Instead, he stepped closer to the cliff's edge, his small hand finding the same fence post his father had been gripping. "Do you think Mom and Mikey can see us from up there?" he asked, pointing toward the darkening sky where the first stars were beginning to appear. The question hit Jake like a physical blow. 3-year-old Mikey had been in the back seat that night, his car seat properly secured, his favorite stuffed elephant clutched in his tiny hands. Claire had been driving home from her sister's house in Copper Falls, the rain making the mountain roads treacherous. The truck that ran the red light had taken them both instantly, the doctor had assured Jake. They hadn't suffered. But Jake suffered every day. "I think they can," he whispered, surprising himself with the admission. He hadn't spoken about Claire and Mikey directly with the children in months, afraid that his own grief would overwhelm them. "Your mom always said the stars were like windows to heaven." Tommy leaned against his father's side, and Jake wrapped his arm around the boy's thin shoulders. They stood in silence for several minutes, watching the sky deepen from purple to black, each lost in their own memories of the family they used to be. "Dad," Tommy's voice was even smaller now. "Are you going to leave us too?" The question stopped Jake's heart. He knelt down to Tommy's level, his hands gentle on the boy's shoulders. "Never," he said with fierce conviction. "I will never leave you and Lily. Do you understand me? Never." Tommy searched his father's face for a long moment, then nodded. Slowly. "Okay," he said. But Jake could hear the uncertainty that lingered beneath the simple word. As they walked back toward the ranch house, Jake's mind wandered to the conversation he'd had with Frank Chin that morning. His neighbor had stopped by to check on them, as he did most weeks, and had mentioned the labor auction happening in Copper Falls the next day. Ranchers from across the region would be there, looking for seasonal workers to help with spring branding and summer hay harvest. Jake had initially dismissed the idea. He couldn't afford to pay fair wages, and the ranch work had been piling up while he struggled to manage the children's needs. But as he looked at the sagging fence posts, the overgrown pastures, and the barn that needed repairs he couldn't find time to complete, he wondered if maybe Frank was right. Maybe he needed help, even if it meant stretching their already tight budget. The ranch house came into view, a sprawling log structure that Claire had filled with warmth and laughter. Now it felt too big and too empty, despite the presence of his 2 surviving children. Yellow lights spilled from the kitchen windows, and Jake could see 5-year-old Lily sitting at the big wooden table, her blonde hair falling in tangles around her face as she colored in a book with intense concentration. Claire had always braided Lily's hair in the mornings, weaving intricate patterns that lasted all day. Jake had tried to learn, watching YouTube videos and practicing on patient stuffed animals, but his large hands seemed incapable of the delicate work. Most days, Lily's hair hung loose and wild, a constant reminder of all the things he couldn't provide for his children. "Daddy." Lily looked up as they entered the kitchen, her face brightening with the uncomplicated joy that only small children possessed. "Look what I drew." Jake examined the crayon drawing she held up proudly. 4 stick figures stood in front of a house, their faces marked with bright smiles. 2 larger figures and 2 smaller ones. But something was missing from the picture. That made Jake's chest tighten with fresh grief. "That's beautiful, sweetheart," he said, kissing the top of her head. "Who are these people?" "That's you and me and Tommy," Lily explained, pointing to each figure. "And that's our new mommy." The innocence of the statement hit Jake like a punch to the gut. He glanced at Tommy, who was watching his sister with the protective expression he'd worn since the accident, as if he understood things Lily was still too young to grasp. "Lily," Tommy said gently, "we talked about this. Mom isn't coming back." Lily's lower lip jutted out stubbornly. "I know that," she said with the confidence of a child who didn't fully understand what she was saying. "But we can get a new one. Tommy said you can buy anything if you have enough money." Jake sat down heavily at the table, pulling Lily onto his lap. How could he explain to a 5-year-old that mothers weren't replaceable? That the love he'd shared with Claire was irreplaceable? That no amount of money could fill the void her death had left in their family? "It doesn't work that way, baby girl," he said softly, smoothing her tangled hair. "Mommies are special. They can't just be bought or replaced." But Lily had already moved on to another drawing, her attention span typical for her age. Jake watched her color, marveling at her resilience even as his heart ached for the complexity of loss she would eventually have to understand. Later that evening, after he'd managed to heat up frozen dinners and supervise baths, Jake sat alone in the living room with a beer growing warm in his hands. The children were finally asleep, Tommy reading quietly in his room until exhaustion claimed him, and Lily curled up with the stuffed rabbit that had become her constant companion since the accident. The silence in the house was deafening. No Claire humming while she folded laundry, no Mikey's delighted giggles echoing from the playroom, no family movie nights with all of them piled together on the big sectional couch. Just Jake and his thoughts, and the crushing weight of responsibility he felt unequipped to handle. He thought about Frank's suggestion again. The labor auction in Copper Falls might be exactly what he needed, not just for the ranch work, but for the children. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. They needed stability, routine, someone who could provide the kind of care Jake was struggling to give them. Maybe hiring domestic help wasn't admitting failure. Maybe it was finally accepting that he couldn't do everything alone. The decision felt both practical and desperate as he climbed the stairs to check on the children one last time before bed. Tommy was sprawled across his twin bed, a book about mountain wildlife still open beside his pillow. Jake closed the book gently and pulled the covers up to his son's chin, marveling at how peaceful the boy looked in sleep, free from the worries that seemed to weigh on him during waking hours. Lily's room was next, painted in soft pastels that Claire had chosen when they first learned they were having a daughter. The little girl was talking in her sleep, a habit she'd developed since the accident. Jake couldn't make out the words, but her tone was conversational, as if she were having an important discussion with someone only she could see. Standing in the doorway, Jake made a silent promise to his sleeping daughter and to the wife he'd lost. Tomorrow, he would go to Copper Falls. Tomorrow, he would find someone who could help bring stability back to their broken home. Tomorrow, he would take the first step toward rebuilding their lives, even if he had no idea what that would look like. The drive to Copper Falls the next morning was longer than Jake remembered, winding through mountain passes that were still dusted with late spring snow. He'd left the children with Mary Chan, Frank's wife, who had insisted it was no trouble to watch them for the day. Tommy had been reluctant to leave the ranch, but Lily had been excited about playing with the Chin's golden retriever, Max. The auction was being held in the parking lot behind the county courthouse, a makeshift affair with folding chairs set up in rows facing a small raised platform. Jake had attended cattle auctions before, but this felt different, more desperate somehow. The people waiting to be hired stood in small groups, their faces weathered by hard work and harder circumstances. Some were clearly seasonal workers, experienced hands who traveled from ranch to ranch following the work. Others looked like they were there out of necessity rather than choice. Jake found a seat near the back, uncomfortable with the entire process, but knowing he needed help more than he needed his pride. The auctioneer was a thin man with a voice that carried across the parking lot, calling out skills and asking prices with the efficiency of someone who'd done this many times before. Most of the workers went quickly, experienced ranch hands commanding good wages from ranchers who knew their value. Jake bid half-heartedly on a few, but was quickly outbid by larger operations with deeper pockets. As the afternoon wore on, he began to think the trip had been a waste of time and gas money he couldn't spare. Then she appeared. The woman who stepped onto the platform was unlike the others who had come before. Where they had been resigned or eager, she stood with quiet dignity despite her obvious exhaustion. Her dark hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail, and her clothes were worn but clean. But it was her eyes that captured Jake's attention, green eyes that held a depth of pain he recognized from his own mirror. She looked out over the crowd with the expression of someone who had learned not to expect kindness from the world, yet hadn't given up hope entirely. There was something about her posture, the way she held herself straight despite whatever circumstances had brought her here, that reminded Jake of strength he'd seen in Claire during her most difficult moments. "This here's Sarah," the auctioneer announced, consulting a clipboard. "Says she's got experience with childcare and household management. Looking for domestic work. Can cook, clean, and she's good with kids. What am I bid?" The bidding started low, almost insultingly so. Jake found himself studying Sarah's face as the numbers were called out, watching for any sign of humiliation or defeat. But she kept her chin up, her gaze steady, as if she were somewhere else entirely in her mind. $50 a week, someone called from the front row. 60, came another voice. Jake's hand twitched, but he didn't raise it. $60 a week was more than he could afford, and he still didn't know anything about this woman beyond the auctioneer's brief description. 75, bid a rancher Jake recognized from the far side of the valley, a man known for working his help hard and paying them little. Something cold settled in Jake's stomach at the thought of Sarah ending up there. He'd heard stories about that ranch, about workers who disappeared in the middle of the night and questions that never got answered. The woman on the platform deserved better than that, even if he didn't know her story. 100, Jake heard himself say, his voice carrying across the parking lot before he'd consciously decided to bid. Heads turned to look at him, including Sarah's. For just a moment, their eyes met across the distance, and Jake saw something flicker in her expression. Surprise, maybe, or relief. The connection lasted only seconds, but it was enough to convince him he'd made the right decision. 100 going once, the auctioneer called. Going twice. Sold to the gentleman in the back. As Jake made his way forward to complete the transaction, he wondered what he'd just gotten himself into. He knew nothing about Sarah beyond what he'd observed in those few minutes on the platform. He didn't know where she'd come from or what circumstances had brought her to this desperate place. He didn't know if she'd be good with his children or if she'd even want to stay once she saw the chaos his life had become. But as he approached the platform where Sarah waited with that same quiet dignity, Jake felt something he hadn't experienced in 18 months. Not hope, exactly, but possibility. The possibility that maybe, just maybe, this stranger could help him put the pieces of his family back together. "Ma'am," he said, removing his hat as she stepped down from the platform. "I'm Jake Morrison. I run a cattle ranch about an hour north of here." Sarah studied his face for a moment before responding, her voice soft but clear. "Sarah Collins," she said simply. "Thank you for—" She gestured vaguely toward the platform, unable or unwilling to finish the sentence. "No need to thank me," Jake replied, settling his hat back on his head. "I need help, and you need work. Seems like we might be able to help each other." The drive back to the ranch was quiet, both Jake and Sarah lost in their own thoughts as the truck wound through the mountain passes. Sarah sat pressed against the passenger door, her small duffel bag clutched in her lap like a shield. Every few minutes, Jake caught her glancing at him sideways, as if trying to figure out what kind of man had just changed the course of her life. Jake found himself doing the same thing, stealing glances at his passenger when he thought she wasn't looking. Up close, he could see that she was probably in her late 20s, with fine lines around her eyes that spoke of stress rather than age. Her hands were work-worn but graceful, and she held herself with the careful control of someone who had learned to take up as little space as possible. "Can I ask you something?" Jake said finally, breaking the silence that had stretched between them since leaving Copper Falls. Sarah tensed slightly, but nodded. Of course. What brought you to that auction? You don't seem like someone who belongs there. For a long moment, Sarah was quiet, her gaze fixed on the mountain scenery passing outside the window. When she finally spoke, her voice was carefully controlled. Sometimes life doesn't go the way you plan, she said. Sometimes you end up in places you never thought you'd be. Jake recognized the careful non-answer for what it was, but he didn't push. He had his own secrets, his own places he didn't like to talk about. Fair enough, he said. We all have our stories. Sarah relaxed slightly at his acceptance of her privacy. What about you? She asked. Why were you at an auction for domestic help? Most ranchers hire through agencies or word of mouth. Jake's hands tightened on the steering wheel. My wife died 18 months ago, he said, the words still difficult to say aloud. Car accident. She was everything to our family. I'm not doing a very good job of filling that void. I'm sorry, Sarah said, and Jake could hear genuine sympathy in her voice. How many children do you have? 2 now, Jake replied, then caught himself. I mean 2. Tommy's 8, and Lily just turned 5. They're good kids, but they need. He trailed off, unsure how to finish the sentence. They need stability, Sarah finished for him. Routine. Someone who can give them the kind of attention you probably can't provide while running a ranch alone. Jake glanced at her, surprised by her understanding. Exactly. I love them more than anything, but I'm failing them. I can't braid Lily's hair. I burn half the meals I try to cook. Tommy started acting like he's responsible for taking care of everyone, and that's not fair to him. Sarah was quiet for a moment, processing what he'd told her. What happened? To your 3rd child? She asked gently. The question hit Jake like a physical blow, even though he'd opened the door to it with his earlier slip. Mikey was 3, he said, his voice rough with emotion. He was in the car with my wife. They both. He couldn't finish the sentence. I'm so sorry, Sarah said again, and this time Jake heard something deeper in her voice. Not just sympathy, but recognition. The sound of someone who understood loss in a way that only came from personal experience. They were approaching the turnoff to the Morrison Ranch when Sarah spoke again. Mr. Morrison, she said formally, I should tell you that I might not be the right person for this job. I don't have references, and there are things about my situation that might complicate your life. Jake slowed the truck, pulling over at the side of the mountain road. He turned to face Sarah directly, taking in her worried expression and the way she was gripping her duffel bag like a lifeline. Let me tell you what I see, he said quietly. I see a woman who's clearly educated and capable, who ended up at that auction through circumstances I'm guessing weren't entirely her choice. I see someone who's been hurt but hasn't given up fighting. And right now, that's exactly what my children need to see. Someone who knows what it's like to survive something terrible but keeps going anyway. Sarah's eyes filled with tears, she quickly blinked away. You don't know what you're saying, she whispered. You don't know what kind of trouble I might bring to your door. Jake reached across the space between them, his hand gently covering hers where it gripped the bag. Sarah, he said, using her name for the first time, we're all carrying trouble, of one kind or another. The question is whether we're going to carry it alone or help each other bear the load. For a moment, Sarah stared at their joined hands, and Jake felt her fingers relax slightly under his touch. When she looked up at him, there was something vulnerable and hopeful in her green eyes that made his chest tighten with an emotion he couldn't name. Okay, she said softly. I'll try, but I need you to promise me something. What's that? If I ever become a danger to you or your children, you'll let me go. No questions, no arguments. You'll just let me disappear. The intensity of her request sent a chill down Jake's spine, but he found himself nodding. I promise, he said, though he couldn't imagine circumstances that would make him want to send this woman away. Sarah smiled for the first time since he'd met her, a small but genuine expression that transformed her entire face. Then let's go home, she said. The word home hung in the air between them as Jake put the truck back in gear and continued toward the ranch. Neither of them spoke for the remaining miles, but the silence felt different now. Less wary, more expectant, like they were both holding their breath, waiting to see what would happen when their carefully guarded worlds collided. The Morrison Ranch came into view as they crested the final hill, the sprawling log house nestled in the valley with the barn and outbuildings spread around it like protective arms. The late afternoon sun painted everything in golden light, making the property look almost magical despite the obvious signs of neglect that Jake saw every day. "It's beautiful," Sarah said softly, and Jake heard genuine appreciation in her voice. "It was," Jake replied, parking the truck near the front porch. "It could be again, with some work." As they climbed out of the truck, the front door burst open and Lily came running across the yard, her blonde hair flying behind her like a banner. Tommy followed more slowly, his 8-year-old dignity keeping him from running, but his curiosity clearly aroused by the sight of the stranger. "Daddy!" Lily launched herself at Jake's legs, wrapping her arms around him with the uncomplicated affection that still had the power to heal small pieces of his broken heart. "Did you bring us a surprise?" Jake looked over Lily's head at Sarah, who was watching the reunion with an expression of carefully controlled emotion. "This is Sarah," he told his daughter. "She's going to be staying with us for a while to help around the ranch." Lily turned to study Sarah with the frank curiosity of a 5-year-old. "Are you going to be our new mommy?" she asked with typical childhood directness. Jake felt his face burn with embarrassment. "Lily, that's not," he started to say, but Sarah knelt down to Lily's level, bringing herself eye to eye with the little girl. "I'm Sarah," she said gently. "I'm here to help your daddy and to be your friend, if you'd like that." Lily considered this for a moment. Her head tilted to one side. "Can you braid hair?" she asked, reaching up to touch her own tangled locks. Sarah's smile widened slightly. "I can," she confirmed. "Would you like me to show you?" The simple offer seemed to break down all of Lily's remaining reserve. She nodded enthusiastically and slipped her small hand into Sarah's, already chattering about her stuffed animals and her favorite colors as she led the way toward the house. Tommy hung back, studying Sarah with the cautious expression Jake had become accustomed to seeing on his son's face. The boy had learned to be wary of changes to protect himself and his sister from further disappointment. "Hi, Tommy," Sarah said, not approaching him but acknowledging him directly. "Your dad told me you're 8. That must make you the man of the house when he's working." Tommy straightened slightly at the recognition of his responsibilities. "I take care of Lily," he said quietly, "and I help with the ranch work when I can." "That's a big job for someone your age," Sarah replied seriously. "Maybe you can show me around tomorrow? Help me learn how things work here?" Something in Tommy's expression softened at being asked rather than told, at being treated like the responsible person he'd been forced to become. "I guess I could do that," he said, trying to sound casual despite the interest Jake could see in his eyes. As they walked toward the house together, Jake felt something shift in the atmosphere around them. It was subtle, like the first hint of spring after a long winter, but unmistakable. For the first time in 18 months, the Morrison Ranch felt like it might become a home again. Sarah paused at the front door, her hand resting on the frame as she looked back at Jake. "Thank you," she said quietly, "for giving me this chance." Jake met her gaze, seeing something in her green eyes that made his pulse quicken in a way he hadn't felt since Claire died. "Thank you," he replied, "for saying yes." As they crossed the threshold together, Jake couldn't shake the feeling that his life had just taken a turn he never could have anticipated when he woke up that morning. Sarah Collins was clearly more than she appeared to be, carrying secrets that might complicate all their lives. But watching her gentle interaction with his children, seeing the first genuine smiles on their faces in months, Jake found himself hoping that whatever trouble she brought with her would be worth the light she seemed to carry. The sun was setting behind the mountains as they entered the house, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold that Claire had always said meant good luck was coming. Jake had stopped believing in such things after the accident, but as he watched Sarah help Lily hang up her jacket and listen to his daughter's delighted chatter about finally having someone to braid her hair, he wondered if maybe, just maybe, his luck was finally about to change. The first week with Sarah at the Morrison Ranch passed like a dream Jake wasn't sure he wanted to wake from. She moved through the house with quiet efficiency, transforming chaos into order without making any of them feel criticized or displaced. The kitchen, which had become Jake's nemesis over the past 18 months, suddenly produced meals that the children actually wanted to eat. Lily's hair appeared each morning in neat braids adorned with small wildflowers Sarah picked during her early morning walks around the property. But it was the subtle changes in his children that amazed Jake most. Tommy had begun talking more at dinner, sharing stories about his day and asking Sarah questions about everything from why the sky turned different colors at sunset to how birds knew which way to fly south. Lily had started sleeping through the night without the nightmares that had plagued her since the accident, and her laughter could be heard echoing through the house again. Sarah herself remained something of an enigma. She was clearly educated, speaking with a precision that suggested college training, yet she seemed equally comfortable mucking out stalls or mending fence. She never mentioned her past beyond vague references to before, and Jake found himself respecting her privacy even as his curiosity grew stronger each day. It was on a Thursday morning, exactly 8 days after bringing Sarah home, that Jake's peaceful new routine shattered like glass against stone. He was in the barn, checking on a mare that was due to foal any day, when the sound of vehicles approaching caught his attention. Multiple engines, moving fast up the mountain road that led only to his ranch. Jake straightened, wiping his hands on his jeans as he walked to the barn door. 3 black SUVs were pulling into his yard, their windows tinted dark against the morning sun. The vehicles moved with military precision, parking in formation that blocked all the main exits from the property. Jake's stomach dropped as he recognized the tactical positioning. These weren't lost tourists or ranchers coming to buy cattle. The first man to emerge from the lead vehicle was tall and lean, wearing an expensive suit that looked completely out of place against the rural Montana backdrop. His dark hair was graying at the temples, and he moved with the confident stride of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question. Behind him, 6 other men filed out of the vehicles, all wearing similar dark clothing and the alert expressions of professional security. Jake started walking toward the house, his mind racing. Sarah was inside with the children, probably preparing their mid-morning snack as she did every day. Tommy would be at the kitchen table working on his correspondence course lessons, while Lily played with her dolls nearby. The image of these hard-faced strangers entering that domestic scene filled Jake with cold dread. The man in the suit spotted Jake approaching and changed direction to intercept him. His smile was practiced and empty, the kind politicians wore when delivering bad news. "Mr. Morrison," the man called out, his voice carrying easily across the yard. "Beautiful property you have here. Very isolated, very private." Jake stopped about 10 feet away, his hands loose at his sides, but ready to move if necessary. "Can I help you, gentlemen?" he asked, his voice deliberately calm despite the adrenaline coursing through his system. "I certainly hope so," the man replied, reaching into his jacket. Jake tensed, but the man only withdrew a leather wallet, flipping it open to reveal a badge and identification. "Detective Ray Kendrick, Denver Police Department. We're looking for someone who we believe might be in this area." "This is Montana," Jake pointed out. "Long way from your jurisdiction." Kendrick's smile widened, but it never reached his eyes. "We're working with local authorities on a fugitive recovery operation. Interstate crime has a way of crossing jurisdictional boundaries." Jake glanced toward the house, where he could see a curtain twitch at one of the kitchen windows. Sarah would be watching, trying to assess the threat these men represented. The thought of her afraid sent anger spiraling through his chest. "What kind of fugitive?" Jake asked, playing for time while he tried to figure out how to handle the situation. "The dangerous kind," Kendrick replied smoothly. "Sarah Collins, also known as Sarah Bennett, Sarah Martinez, and probably half a dozen other aliases by now. She's wanted for questioning in connection with several serious crimes in Colorado." Jake kept his expression neutral despite the confirmation of his worst fears. These men were here for Sarah, and they weren't the kind who would be satisfied with explanations or legal delays. "Never heard of her," Jake said flatly, "and I'd appreciate it if you'd state your business and move on. I've got work to do." Kendrick studied Jake's face with the intensity of a predator evaluating prey. "Mr. Morrison, we have reliable intelligence that Sarah Collins was seen at the labor auction in Copper Falls last week. We also know that you were the winning bidder for a woman matching her description." Ice formed in Jake's stomach. If they knew about the auction, they'd been tracking Sarah for weeks, possibly months. This wasn't a random search or a lucky guess. They'd been closing in on her systematically, and somehow she'd ended up leading them straight to his family. "I hired domestic help," Jake admitted, seeing no point in denying what they already knew. "A woman named Sarah. But I don't know anything about her background or any crimes in Colorado." "Of course not," Kendrick agreed with false sympathy. She's very good at reinventing herself, at making people believe she's just an innocent woman down on her luck. But the truth is, Mr. Morrison, that Sarah Collins is responsible for the death of a young man in Denver, a respected member of the community whose only crime was trying to help her. The words hit Jake like physical blows, each one designed to plant seeds of doubt about the woman who had brought such peace to his home. But even as part of his mind wondered if there could be truth in Kendrick's accusations, a larger part rejected them entirely. The Sarah he'd come to know was gentle with his children, patient with their questions, careful never to overstep boundaries. Whatever these men thought she'd done, Jake was certain there was more to the story. Even if that were true, Jake said carefully, "What makes you think she's here?" Kendrick's expression hardened slightly, the polite facade slipping just enough to reveal something colder underneath. "Because we've been watching this ranch for 3 days, Mr. Morrison. We know she's here. We know she's been playing house with you and your children. The question is whether you're going to cooperate with law enforcement or whether we're going to have to consider you an accessory after the fact." The threat was clear, delivered with the casual confidence of a man who was used to getting his way through intimidation. Jake felt his temper flare, but he forced himself to remain calm. Losing control now wouldn't help Sarah or protect his children. "I want to see warrants," Jake said firmly. "Federal warrants, since you're operating outside your jurisdiction. And I want to speak with the local sheriff before anyone sets foot in my house." Kendrick's smile returned, but this time it was genuinely amused. "Mr. Morrison, you seem to be under the impression that this is a negotiation. It's not. We have sufficient probable cause to search these premises for a known fugitive. Your cooperation would be appreciated, but it's not required." At a gesture from Kendrick, 4 of his men began moving toward the house, while the other 2 flanked Jake, positioning themselves to prevent him from interfering. Jake took a step forward, his hands clenching into fists, but stopped when he heard the front door open. Sarah emerged onto the porch, moving with the same quiet dignity Jake had first noticed at the auction. She'd changed into a simple blue dress that he'd never seen before, and her dark hair was pulled back in a neat bun. She looked composed and unafraid, but Jake could see the tension in the set of her shoulders. "Detective Kendrick," she called out, her voice carrying clearly across the yard. "Still trying to intimidate innocent families, I see." Kendrick's attention snapped to Sarah, his entire posture changing as he focused on his primary target. "Sarah Collins," he replied, his voice taking on a tone of satisfaction. "Or should I say Sarah Bennett? It's been a long chase, but it's finally over." Sarah descended the porch steps slowly, her gaze never leaving Kendrick's face. "Where are the children, Mr. Morrison?" she asked Jake without looking at him. "Inside," Jake replied, understanding that she was making sure they were safely out of the immediate line of fire. "Good," Sarah said simply. Then, to Kendrick, "What exactly are you charging me with this time, Ray? Or are we still pretending this is about justice instead of covering up your boss's crimes?" Jake caught the familiarity in her tone, the way she used Kendrick's first name. These 2 had a history that went deeper than a simple fugitive pursuit. The realization sent fresh waves of unease through him, even as he admired Sarah's courage in facing down 7 armed men without flinching. Kendrick's mask slipped entirely, revealing naked hatred underneath. "You cost Judge Cross's son," he snarled. "Victor was a good man, a pillar of the community. He was trying to help you, and you murdered him for it." "Victor Cross was a rapist and a killer," Sarah replied with icy calm. "And you know it. You were there that night, Ray. You saw what he did to my sister. You helped cover it up." The accusation hung in the air like a toxic cloud, and Jake saw several of Kendrick's men exchange uncertain glances. Whatever they'd been told about this operation, it clearly hadn't included Sarah's version of events. "Careful, Sarah," Kendrick warned, his hand moving toward his weapon. "Slandering a judge's family is a serious crime. Of course, you won't live long enough to worry about the legal consequences." The naked threat sent Jake into motion without conscious thought. He stepped between Sarah and Kendrick, his own considerable size making him an imposing barrier. "That's enough," he said, his voice carrying the authority of a man defending his own land. "I don't know what happened between you people in Colorado, and I don't care. But you're not threatening anyone on my property." Kendrick laughed, a sound devoid of humor. "Your property, Mr. Morrison? How long do you think you'll keep this ranch once you're arrested as an accessory to murder? How long before your children end up in foster care while you rot in prison for harboring a fugitive? The words hit their target, and Jake felt fear spike through his anger. He'd never considered that helping Sarah might put Tommy and Lily at risk. The possibility of losing his children, of them being taken away because of decisions he'd made, was more terrifying than any physical threat. Sarah must have sensed his uncertainty because she moved to stand beside him rather than behind him. Jake, she said quietly, using his first name for the first time since arriving at the ranch. I need you to trust me. Can you do that? Jake looked down at her, seeing something in her green eyes that he couldn't quite identify. Determination, certainly, but also a deep sadness that spoke of sacrifices she was prepared to make. Yes, he said simply, the word carrying more weight than any oath. Sarah nodded once, then raised her voice to address Kendrick again. I'll come with you, she announced. Peacefully, no resistance. But you leave Mr. Morrison and his children alone. They had nothing to do with what happened in Denver. Sarah, no. Jake started to protest, but she silenced him with a look. It's the only way, she said softly. You have to trust me. Kendrick's satisfaction was visible as he gestured for his men to move forward. Finally showing some sense, he said. Though I'm afraid it's too late for your boyfriend here. He's already an accessory by harboring you. Actually, a new voice interrupted from the direction of the road. He's not. All heads turned to see a dusty pickup truck pulling into the yard, followed by two sheriff's department vehicles. Sheriff Bob Martinez emerged from the lead car, his weathered face grim as he took in the scene. Behind him, two of his deputies flanked a woman Jake didn't recognize, someone in an expensive business suit who moved with the confidence of federal authority. Sheriff Martinez, Kendrick called out, his tone shifting to professional courtesy. We're conducting a fugitive recovery operation. Everything's under control here. Martinez spat into the dust at his feet, his opinion of that statement clear. Funny thing, Detective Kendrick. I just got a call from the FBI field office in Billings. Seems they've been investigating Judge Cross and his operation for the better part of 2 years. Very interested in talking to Miss Collins here as a protected witness. The blood drained from Kendrick's face as the woman in the suit stepped forward, displaying her own badge and identification. Special Agent Lisa Torres, FBI, she announced. Detective Kendrick, you and your men are operating outside your jurisdiction without proper authorization. I'm going to have to ask you to stand down. Jake felt the world tilt around him as the situation suddenly reversed itself. Sarah wasn't the fugitive these men were claiming. She was a witness, someone important enough that the FBI had been protecting her. The relief was so intense it left him lightheaded. This is impossible, Kendrick snarled, but Jake could see the fear beginning to creep into his expression. Judge Cross assured me. Judge Cross is currently under federal indictment, Agent Torres interrupted smoothly, along with several members of his organization, including certain Denver police officers who've been helping him cover up his son's crimes. The implications of her words hit Kendrick like hammer blows. His empire was crumbling around him, and the woman he'd been hunting was about to become the star witness in his own prosecution. Several of his men were already backing away, clearly unwilling to go down with a sinking ship. Sarah moved closer to Jake, her hand finding his arm in a gesture that was both seeking comfort and offering reassurance. I'm sorry, she whispered. I never meant to bring this to your door. Jake covered her hand with his own, marveling at how fragile she felt despite the strength she'd shown throughout the confrontation. It's okay, he murmured back. Whatever happened before, we'll figure it out. But even as he spoke the words, Jake wondered if that was true. Sarah had secrets that went far deeper than he'd imagined, connections to federal investigations and dangerous men who were willing to kill to keep their crimes hidden. The peaceful life they'd been building at the ranch suddenly seemed as fragile as morning frost. Agent Torres was handcuffing Kendrick while reading him his rights, her voice professional and detached. The other men were being processed by Sheriff Martinez's deputies, their weapons confiscated and their vehicles impounded as evidence. Miss Collins, Agent Torres called out once Kendrick was secured. We need to discuss your continued protection arrangements. The safe house in Denver has been compromised, obviously, but we have other options. Sarah's grip on Jake's arm tightened, and he could feel her trembling slightly. The thought of her being taken away, of disappearing into federal protection where he might never see her again, sent panic racing through his system. She stays. Here, Jake heard himself say, the words emerging before he'd fully thought them through. Agent Torres raised an eyebrow. Mr. Morrison, I appreciate your concern, but Miss Collins's safety requires professional protection. The Cross organization has extensive resources and long reach. How long? Sarah asked quietly. How long until the trial? Until this is over. Torres consulted a tablet she'd pulled from her briefcase. The federal case is complex, involving multiple jurisdictions and defendants. Realistically, we're looking at 18 to 24 months before everything is resolved. 2 years. Jake felt the number hit him like a physical blow. 2 years of Sarah in witness protection, hidden away where Tommy and Lily couldn't reach her, where the fragile healing that had begun in their family would be interrupted indefinitely. There has to be another way, he said desperately. You said yourself the Cross organization was being dismantled. How dangerous can it be if their leadership is in federal custody? Agent Torres studied Jake's face, clearly weighing his words. Against protocols and procedures. Mr. Morrison, I understand your attachment to Miss Collins, but it's not about attachment, Jake interrupted, though he wasn't entirely sure that was true. It's about my children. They've lost enough. Already. They don't need to lose someone else who's become important to them. Sarah looked up at him, something shifting in her expression as she processed his words. Jake, she said softly, you can't ask your family to live with this kind of danger for my sake. I'm not asking, Jake replied firmly. I'm deciding. This is my land, my family, my choice. If the FBI thinks they can keep you safe here, then you stay. Agent Torres looked between them, clearly recognizing the depth of emotion underlying the practical discussion. It would be highly irregular, she said slowly. We'd need to establish a security protocol, install monitoring equipment, provide emergency procedures. Whatever it takes, Jake said immediately. And if the situation becomes too dangerous? If we determine that Miss Collins needs to be moved for her own safety or yours? Jake felt Sarah's eyes on him, waiting for his answer. The smart thing, the safe thing, would be to agree to let the FBI take her whenever they deemed it necessary. But looking at this woman who had brought such light back into his children's lives, who had made him remember what it felt like to hope for something beyond mere survival, Jake couldn't bring himself to be smart or safe. Then we'll deal with that if it happens, he said. But until then, she stays. Agent Torres nodded slowly, making notes on her tablet. Very well, Mr. Morrison. We'll make the arrangements. But I want you to understand that this decision puts not only Miss Collins at risk, but your entire family. Are you prepared for that responsibility? Jake looked down at Sarah, seeing the mixture of gratitude and fear in her green eyes. We're already at risk, he said quietly. We have been since the day I brought her home. The difference is now we know what we're fighting against. As Agent Torres began making phone calls to arrange the security protocols, Jake found himself wondering what he'd just committed himself and his children to. The peaceful ranch life he'd been trying to rebuild was about to become something entirely different, something dangerous and uncertain. But watching Sarah's face as she realized she wouldn't have to disappear again, seeing the relief and hope that replaced the resigned acceptance she'd worn since Kendrick's arrival, Jake knew he'd made the right choice. Whatever came next, they would face it together. The sun was setting behind the mountains as the last of the federal vehicles pulled away from the ranch, leaving behind a landscape that looked the same but felt completely transformed. Sarah stood beside Jake on the front porch, both of them, watching the dust settle on the road that had brought so much upheaval to their quiet world. Thank you, Sarah said finally, her voice barely audible above the evening breeze. Jake turned to study her profile, noting the exhaustion that had settled over her features now that the immediate crisis had passed. For what? For believing me. For not turning me over to them. For, she gestured helplessly, for everything. Jake reached out and gently turned her to face him, his hands resting on her shoulders. Sarah, he said seriously, I need you to know something. What happened today, what I learned about your past, it doesn't change anything between us. You're still the woman who braided my daughter's hair and made my son smile again. You're still part of this family. Tears gathered in Sarah's eyes, threatening to spill over. You don't understand, she whispered. You don't know what I've done, what I might have to do. The trial, the testimony, it's going to dredge up everything. All the ugly details of what Victor Cross did, what his father helped cover up. It won't be quiet or peaceful anymore. Jake pulled her closer, his arms encircling her in a gesture that was both protective and possessive. Then we'll face the noise together, he said firmly. All of us, as a family. The word hung between them, loaded with implications that neither of them was quite ready to examine too closely. But as Sarah leaned into his embrace, Jake felt something settle into place in his chest, a sense of rightness that he hadn't experienced since Claire's death. Inside the house, he could hear Tommy and Lily chattering excitedly about the days. Dramatic events, their voices high with the thrill of real-life adventure. They would need explanations, reassurances, preparation for the changes that were coming to their lives. But for this moment, Jake allowed himself to simply hold the woman who had become so essential to their healing. Whatever storms lay ahead, the Morrison family would weather them together. And for the first time since that terrible night 18 months ago, Jake Morrison believed they might all survive intact. Part 3. First Connections. The 3 weeks following the confrontation with Detective Kendrick transformed the Morrison Ranch into something resembling a small military installation. Agent Torres had been true to her word about security protocols, installing motion sensors along the perimeter, cameras at strategic points, and a direct communication line to the FBI field office in Billings. Jake had initially been overwhelmed by the technological invasion of his previously simple life, but he quickly adapted when he saw how much safer the measures made Sarah feel. The most significant change wasn't technological, however. It was the gradual shift in the family dynamic as Sarah evolved from hired help to something much more integral to their daily existence. The children had accepted the security measures, with the adaptability of youth, treating the whole situation like an extended adventure game. Tommy, in particular, seemed fascinated by the protective protocols, asking Agent Torres detailed questions about surveillance techniques and threat assessment during her weekly check-ins. It was during one of these visits, on a crisp morning, in early June, that Jake first noticed the depth of change in his son. Tommy was demonstrating his knowledge of the ranch's new security perimeter to Agent Torres, pointing out camera positions and explaining the purpose of various sensors with the confidence of someone who had not only memorized the information, but understood its significance. Your boy's got a good tactical mind, Agent Torres commented to Jake as they watched Tommy lead the tour. He'd make a fine federal agent someday, if he's interested. Jake felt a complex mixture of pride and concern at the observation. Pride in Tommy's intelligence and adaptability, but concern about what it meant that his 8-year-old son was becoming an expert in personal security. This wasn't the childhood Jake had envisioned for either of his children when he and Claire had first started their family. Tommy's always been observant, Jake replied carefully, maybe too observant for his own good. Sarah, who had been listening to the conversation while helping Lily with her morning lessons at the kitchen table, looked up with understanding in her eyes. Children adapt to their circumstances, she said quietly, sometimes in ways that show remarkable strength. The comment carried weight that Jake was beginning to recognize as typical of Sarah's observations. She rarely spoke about her own childhood, but her insights into child psychology suggested experiences that went deeper than textbook knowledge. There were layers to her past that she hadn't shared, even now that her basic situation had been explained. Agent Torres finished her security briefing and departed, leaving the family to their morning routine. Jake was preparing to head out to check the cattle when Sarah approached him, her expression serious. "Can we talk?" she asked, glancing toward the children to make sure they were occupied. Privately, Jake nodded, leading her out to the front porch where they could speak without being overheard. The morning air was crisp with the promise of summer, and the mountains stretched endlessly toward the horizon in shades of green and gold that never failed to humble him. "What's on your mind?" Jake asked, settling into one of the wooden chairs Claire had picked out during their first year of marriage. Sarah remained standing, her hands clasped behind her back in a gesture Jake had learned meant she was struggling with something difficult. "I've been thinking about what Agent Torres said," she began. "About Tommy having a tactical mind, about him adapting to these security measures so easily. And I'm worried that we're normalizing a level of vigilance that no child should have to live with," Sarah continued. Tommy's becoming hyper-aware of potential threats, constantly scanning for problems. That's not healthy development for an 8-year-old. Jake had been harboring similar concerns, but hearing them voiced by Sarah made them more concrete and troubling. "What are you suggesting?" he asked, though he suspected he already knew. "Maybe I should go into formal protection after all," Sarah said quietly. "Maybe trying to keep me here is asking too much of your family." The suggestion hit Jake harder than he'd expected. Over the past 3 weeks, he'd grown accustomed to having Sarah as part of their daily life in ways that went far beyond her practical contributions. She'd become the person he shared morning coffee with while the children slept, the one who helped him work through difficult decisions about ranch management or parenting challenges. She'd become his partner in ways he hadn't fully acknowledged, until faced with the possibility of losing her. "No," he said firmly, the word emerging with more force than he'd intended. Sarah's eyebrows rose slightly at his vehemence. "Jake, you need to consider what's best for Tommy and Lily. They've already been through so much trauma, which is exactly why they need stability now." Jake interrupted. "Not another loss, another person disappearing from their lives without warning." Sarah moved to the porch railing, her gaze fixed on the distant mountains. "I never intended to become so important to them," she said softly. "When I agreed to stay here, I thought it would be temporary. A few weeks at most before the FBI moved me somewhere safe. But you did become important to them," Jake replied, rising from his chair to stand beside her. "To all of us. And that's not something we can just undo because the situation got complicated." Sarah turned to face him, and Jake was struck by the vulnerability in her expression. "What if staying here ultimately hurts them more than leaving?" "What?" she asked. "What if the trial brings more dangerous people to your door? What if something happens to one of them because I was too selfish to leave when I should have?" Jake reached out and gently took her hands in his, noting how cold her fingers were despite the warming sun. "Sarah, look at me," he said, waiting until her green eyes met his. "Do you remember what you told me that first day when I asked why you ended up at that auction?" Sarah nodded slowly. "I said sometimes life doesn't go the way you plan." "That's right. Sometimes terrible things happen that we can't control or prevent. But that doesn't mean we stop living, stop caring about people, stop building something good out of whatever pieces we have left." Jake paused, gathering his thoughts before continuing. "Claire and I used to talk about what would happen if something happened to one of us. We both agreed that the surviving parent should find love again, should give the children a chance to have a complete family. I never thought I'd be the one having to figure out how to do that." Sarah's eyes widened slightly at the implication of his words. "Jake, I'm not saying we have to figure everything out right now," Jake continued, his voice gentle but determined. "But I am saying that running away from something good because it might be difficult isn't the answer. We'll face whatever comes. Together, as a family. All four of us." The mention of family seemed to break through Sarah's remaining resistance. Tears gathered in her eyes as she processed the full meaning of what Jake was offering. Not just a place to hide, but a genuine belonging, a chance to be part of something permanent and meaningful. "You really mean that?" she whispered. "I've never meant anything more in my life," Jake replied. Before either of them could say anything else, the front door burst open and Lily came running onto the porch, her face bright with excitement. "Sarah, Sarah," she called out, tugging on Sarah's skirt with typical 5-year-old urgency. "Come see what I drew. It's our whole family, and everyone's smiling." Sarah looked down at the little girl, then back at Jake, something settling in. Her expression that looked like decision. "I'd love to see your drawing, sweetie," she said, allowing Lily to pull her toward the door. "Does everyone really look happy?" "Super happy," Lily confirmed enthusiastically. "Because we're all together and nobody's sad anymore." As they headed back inside, Jake caught Sarah's hand, stopping her for just a moment. "She's right, you." "No," he said quietly. "About nobody being sad anymore. At least not the way we were before." Sarah squeezed his hand in return, her smile the first completely unguarded expression he'd seen from her since the day they met. "I'm starting to believe that," she admitted. The rest of the morning passed in the comfortable routine they'd established over the past weeks. Sarah worked with Lily on her reading while Jake and Tommy tackled ranch chores, the four of them moving through their tasks with the synchronized efficiency of a family unit that had learned to function as a team. It was just after lunch when the phone rang, jarring them out of their peaceful rhythm. Jake answered, expecting Agent Torres or Sheriff Martinez with a routine check-in, but the voice on the other end was unfamiliar. Mr. Morrison? This is Dr. Helen Park calling from Denver General Hospital. I understand you're providing protection for Sarah Collins? Jake felt his stomach tighten with apprehension. Who is this exactly, and how did you get this number? I'm a trauma surgeon at Denver General, and I was on duty the night Sarah's sister was brought in. Agent Torres gave me your contact information. I have some information that Sarah needs to hear, information that could be crucial to the federal case. Jake looked across the kitchen to where Sarah was helping Lily with a puzzle, her head bent, close to his daughter's blonde curls. The peaceful domestic scene seemed suddenly fragile, threatened by whatever revelations this phone call might bring. Hold on, Jake said into the phone. Sarah, there's a call for you. Dr. Park from Denver General. The color drained from Sarah's face at the mention of the hospital name. She rose slowly from the table, her movements careful and controlled. As she crossed to take the phone from Jake's hand. Dr. Park, Sarah's voice was steady, but Jake could see the tension in every line of her body. I remember you. You were very kind that night. Jake couldn't hear the other side of the conversation, but he watched Sarah's expression change from wariness to shock to something that might have been hope. Her free hand gripped the kitchen counter as if she needed the support to remain standing. Are you certain? Sarah asked, her voice barely above a whisper. After all this time, you're absolutely certain? Another pause, during which Sarah's eyes found Jake's across the kitchen. He saw something transformative happening in her expression, as if fundamental assumptions about her world were being rearranged. Yes, Sarah said finally. Yes, I understand. Thank you, Dr. Park. Thank you for calling. She hung up the phone but remained frozen by the counter, staring at nothing with an expression of stunned disbelief. Sarah? Jake approached her carefully, aware that the children were watching with growing concern. What is it? What did she say? Sarah blinked several times, as if trying to focus on the present moment. She said, Sarah's voice caught, and she had to start again. She said my sister is alive. The words hung in the air like something impossible, defying everything Sarah had believed for the past 2 years. Jake felt his own world shift as he processed the implications. But you said she died, Jake said gently. You said you buried her yourself. I thought I did, Sarah whispered. But Dr. Park says there was a mix-up at the hospital. An administrative error with patient records. My sister survived her injuries, but she was transferred to a psychiatric facility for treatment of trauma-induced amnesia. The woman I buried. Sarah's voice broke entirely. The woman I buried was someone else. Someone who had been brought in the same night with no identification. Jake reached for Sarah as her legs seemed to give way, catching her before she could fall and guiding her to a chair. Tommy and Lily had abandoned their activities to cluster around them, their young faces showing confusion and concern at the adult's obvious distress. Is Sarah sick? Lily asked, her small hand reaching out to touch Sarah's arm. No, sweetheart, Jake said, his voice gentle as he tried to process this monumental revelation himself. Sarah just got some very surprising news about her family. Tommy, with his 8-year-old's more sophisticated understanding, asked the more pointed question. Good surprising or bad surprising? Sarah looked up at him, tears streaming down her face, but her expression transforming into something radiant. Good surprising, she managed. Very, very good surprising. Dr. Park had provided the name of the facility where Sarah's sister was being treated, along with contact information for the psychiatrist overseeing her care. The sister Sarah had mourned for 2 years was not only alive, but slowly recovering her memory under professional care. The grief that had driven Sarah into hiding, that had made her believe she was the sole survivor of her family's destruction, had been based on a tragic misunderstanding. As the implications of this discovery began to sink in, Jake realized that everything was about to change again. Sarah now had reason to return to Colorado, to be reunited with the sister she thought she'd lost. The federal case against Judge Cross would be stronger with 2 witnesses instead of 1, but it would also mean Sarah's presence at the ranch was no longer necessary for her protection. She could leave. She could reclaim her real life, the one that had been interrupted by violence and corrupted by false grief. She could be with her sister during the recovery process, could rebuild the family connection that had been severed by Cross's machinations. The thought of losing her filled Jake with a panic that surprised him with its intensity. Over the past weeks, Sarah had become more than just help with the children or a woman under his protection. She had become essential to his vision of the future, integral to the healing his family had finally begun to experience. But as he watched her face light up with joy at the prospect of her sister's survival, Jake knew he couldn't ask her to stay for his sake. If Sarah needed to go to Colorado, if reuniting with her sister was what would make her truly happy, then he would help her pack and drive her to the airport himself, even if it broke his heart and shattered the fragile peace his children had just begun to trust. "When can I see her?" Sarah was asking, having composed herself enough to think practically about next steps. "Dr. Park said she's been asking about me, that some of her memories are starting to return. We'll figure it out," Jake assured her, though the words felt like sawdust in his mouth. "Agent Torres will need to coordinate the travel arrangements. Make sure you're protected during the trip." Sarah's hand trembled as she held the phone number Dr. Park had given her for the psychiatric facility. The piece of paper seemed to weigh nothing and everything at once, representing a connection to the sister she had grieved as dead for 2 long years. Emily was alive. Her baby sister, barely 23 when Sarah had last seen her broken and bleeding in that Denver hospital room, was breathing and healing and asking for her. Jake watched Sarah's internal struggle play out across her features, recognizing the war between joy and uncertainty that was clearly consuming her. The children had returned to their activities, but both kept glancing toward the adults with the intuitive awareness that something significant was happening. "I should call the facility," Sarah said finally, her voice still shaky with emotion. "I should speak with her doctor, find out about her condition, when I might be able to visit." "Of course," Jake agreed, though each word felt like he was signing his own emotional death warrant. "Do you want privacy for the call?" Sarah looked at him with an expression that was difficult to read. "No," she said softly. "I'd like you to stay, if that's all right. I might need support." The request surprised Jake, given the intensely personal nature of what she was about to discover. But he nodded and settled into the chair beside her as she dialed the number with careful precision. The conversation that followed was both heartbreaking and hopeful. Dr. Rebecca Walsh, Emily's psychiatrist, explained that Sarah's sister had suffered severe trauma-induced amnesia following her injuries 2 years ago. She had spent months in a catatonic state, unable to speak or respond to stimuli, before gradually beginning to show signs of awareness. "She's been asking for Sarah for the past 3 weeks," Dr. Walsh explained, her voice carrying clearly through the speakerphone. "We weren't sure if it was a real person or a manifestation of her psychological healing process. She's been quite insistent that Sarah would come looking for her." Sarah pressed her hand to her mouth, tears flowing freely as she processed the information. "She remembers me," she whispered. "After everything they did to her, she still remembers." Dr. Walsh continued with clinical details about Emily's progress. Her physical injuries had healed completely, but the psychological trauma ran much deeper. She experienced episodes of severe anxiety when confronted with male authority figures, particularly anyone in uniform. Her short-term memory was still fragmented, though her long-term memories from before the attack seemed largely intact. "She's been making remarkable progress in the past month," Dr. Walsh said. "She started participating in group therapy sessions and has been working with our art therapist to express some of her experiences. I believe seeing you again would be tremendously beneficial to her continued healing." The logistics of a visit were complicated by Sarah's status in federal protection. Agent Torres would need to coordinate with Denver field office, security protocols would need to be established, and the timing would depend on Judge Cross's trial schedule. It could be days or weeks before a visit could be arranged safely. After the call ended, Sarah sat in silence for several minutes, still processing the magnitude of what she'd learned. Jake remained quiet beside her, offering his presence without pressure to talk before she was ready. "I used to dream about her," Sarah said eventually, her voice distant with memory. "After I thought she died, I would dream that she was calling for me, asking why I didn't save her. I thought it was guilt, my mind punishing me for failing to protect her. Maybe it was something else," Jake suggested gently. "Maybe some part of you knew she was still out there." Sarah turned to look at him, her eyes still bright with unshed tears. "Jake, I need to ask you something." and I need you to be completely honest with me. Always. If I go to Denver to be with Emily, if I need to stay there during her recovery and the trial, would you be able to forgive me for leaving Tommy and Lily? For walking away from what we've been building here? The question hit Jake like a physical blow, forcing him to confront the choice he'd been dreading since Dr. Park's call. The rational part of his mind understood that Sarah needed to be with her sister, that family obligations trumped whatever feelings had developed between them. But the emotional reality of losing her, of watching his children's faces when she didn't come home, was almost unbearable to contemplate. Sarah, he said carefully, there's nothing to forgive. Emily is your family. She needs you, and you need to be with her. Tommy and Lily would understand that. Would they? Sarah asked, her voice small and uncertain. Or would they feel abandoned again? Another person they cared about choosing something else over them? Jake saw the genuine anguish in her expression, the impossible position she found herself in, between loyalty to her sister and the family she'd found at the ranch. He realized that his response to her question could influence a decision that would shape all their lives. They'd miss you terribly, he said honestly. We all would. But they'd also want you to be happy, to be with your sister when she needs you most. That's the kind of children they are, the kind Claire raised them to be. Sarah studied his face intently, as if searching for hidden meaning behind his words. And what about you, Jake? What would you want me to do? The question hung between them, loaded with implications neither had been ready to address directly. Jake felt the weight of honesty, the obligation to put Sarah's needs above his own desires. I'd want you to do whatever would give you peace, he said finally, even if that means leaving us. Something shifted in Sarah's expression at his words, a softening that suggested she'd heard more in his response than just noble self-sacrifice. She reached across the space between them and took his hand, her fingers interlacing with his in a gesture that had become natural over the past weeks. What if there was another option? She asked quietly. What if I didn't have to choose between my sister and this family? Jake's pulse quickened at the suggestion, but he forced himself to remain cautious. What do you mean? Dr. Walsh mentioned that Emily might benefit from a change of environment once she's stable enough for discharge. Somewhere quiet and peaceful, away from the reminders of what happened to her in Denver. Somewhere she could continue her recovery while still having access to professional support. The implication was clear, but Jake hardly dared to hope she was suggesting what he thought she might be. The ranch is certainly quiet and peaceful, he said carefully. It's also safe, Sarah continued, her voice gaining strength as she developed. The idea, with all the security measures already in place, it might actually be the perfect environment for someone recovering from trauma. And Montana has excellent psychiatric services in Billings. It's not that far if she needed specialized care. Jake felt hope blooming in his chest, dangerous and wonderful in equal measure. You're talking about bringing Emily here, he said, needing to hear it stated clearly. I'm talking about keeping this family together, Sarah replied, her grip on his hand tightening. All of us. Emily, me, you, Tommy, Lily. Building something bigger and stronger than what any of us could manage alone. The possibility was staggering in its complexity and potential. A household that included a trauma survivor with ongoing psychological needs, 2 children still processing their own grief, a rancher trying to balance protection responsibilities with daily survival, and a woman carrying the weight of federal witness obligations. It should have seemed impossible, overwhelming, destined for disaster. Instead, it felt right in a way that Jake couldn't fully explain, like pieces of a puzzle, finally clicking into place, revealing a picture none of them could have imagined when they started with scattered fragments of broken lives. It wouldn't be easy, Jake said, though he was already envisioning how they might make it work. Emily would need professional support, ongoing therapy. The security situation would be more complex with another person to protect. And there's no guarantee she'd want to leave Colorado, even for her recovery. No guarantees, Sarah agreed, but possibilities. Hope for something better than any of us surviving alone. Before Jake could respond, Tommy appeared in the kitchen doorway, his young face serious with the weight of whatever he'd been thinking about while the adults talked. Is Emily really alive? He asked directly, addressing Sarah with the straightforward manner that had become typical of his communication style. Sarah nodded, wiping away fresh tears that came with speaking the truth aloud to a child. She is. She's been in a hospital in Colorado, getting better from being very sick. Tommy processed this information with the careful consideration he applied to everything these days. Is she going to come live with us like you did? The question caught both adults off guard with its directness and its assumption that Sarah's integration into their family was permanent and complete. Tommy hadn't asked if Sarah was leaving to be with her sister. He'd assumed that family meant bringing people together, not choosing between them. We're talking about that possibility, Jake said carefully. It would be a big change for all of us. Emily has been through some very difficult things, and she might need special care while she gets completely better. Like how Sarah needed time to feel safe when she first came here? Tommy asked with the intuitive understanding that continually amazed Jake. Something like that, Sarah confirmed, her voice thick with emotion at the boy's acceptance. Lily, drawn by the conversation, emerged from the living room where she'd been coloring. Is Emily your little sister like I'm Tommy's little sister? She asked Sarah. Yes, sweetheart. She's my little sister, and I love her very much, just like Tommy loves you. Lily considered this information with 5-year-old logic. Then she should come home with you, she declared with absolute certainty. Little sisters belong with their families. The simple wisdom of the statement hit Jake with unexpected force. Out of the mouths of babes, he thought, recognizing the truth in his daughter's innocent observation. Emily belonged with Sarah, and Sarah belonged with them. The solution wasn't choosing between competing loyalties, but expanding their definition of family to include everyone who needed love and protection. Lily's right, Jake said, his voice carrying new conviction. Family means taking care of each other. All of each other. Sarah's eyes widened at the definitiveness in his tone. Jake, you don't know what you're saying. Emily's going to need professional help, possibly for years. She might never fully recover from what happened to her. Taking on that responsibility is exactly what family does. Jake interrupted gently. Sarah, you've already proven that love and patience can work miracles. Look what you've done for Tommy and Lily in just a few weeks. Look what you've done for me. He paused, realizing that he was approaching the edge of territory they hadn't explicitly explored yet. But the moment felt right for honesty, for laying all the cards on the table. I love you, he said simply, the words emerging with surprising ease. I love what you've brought to our lives, how you've helped us heal, how you've made us whole again. And if loving you means loving your sister too, means making room for her healing journey as part of our family story, then that's what we'll do. Sarah's breath caught at his declaration, her eyes searching his face for any sign of uncertainty or obligation. You love me? She whispered. Completely, Jake confirmed. I didn't plan for it to happen, didn't think I was ready for it to happen. But somewhere between watching you braid Lily's hair and seeing you stand up to armed men to protect my children, I fell in love with who you are and who we become when we're together. Tommy made a small sound of satisfaction, as if this declaration confirmed something he'd been suspecting for weeks. Lily clapped her hands together with delight, apparently thrilled by this development. Does this mean Sarah's going to be our new mommy for real? Lily asked with 5-year-old directness. Jake looked at Sarah, suddenly aware that he'd just made a declaration of love and implied a proposal of marriage in front of his children without actually asking Sarah how she felt about any of it. The realization might have been mortifying under other circumstances, but the situation felt too right for embarrassment. That depends, he said, his eyes never leaving Sarah's face, on whether Sarah thinks she might be able to love a stubborn rancher and 2 children who need her more than they probably should. Sarah's response came not in words, but in actions. She rose from her chair and closed the distance between them, her hands framing his face as she leaned down to kiss him with a tenderness that spoke of answered prayers and dreams coming true. When they broke apart, both children were grinning with satisfaction, as if they'd been waiting for this moment as much as the adults had been unconsciously building toward it. I love you too, Sarah whispered against Jake's lips. All of you. And yes, I think bringing Emily here might be exactly what all of us need. The phone rang again, interrupting the moment of perfect domestic happiness. Agent Torres's number appeared on the caller ID, and Jake felt a familiar spike of tension at the reminder that their lives were still complicated by federal investigations and protection protocols. Mr. Morrison, Agent Torres said without preamble when Jake answered. We've had a development in the Cross case. Judge Cross has agreed to a plea bargain in exchange for his cooperation in exposing the full extent of his organization. Detective Kendrick has also agreed to testify against his former associates. Jake felt Sarah tense beside him as she processed the implications. What does that mean for Sarah's situation? He asked. It means the immediate threat level has dropped significantly, Agent Torres replied. With Cross and Kendrick cooperating, we've been able to identify and arrest most of the key players in their operation. Miss Collins will still need to testify at various proceedings, but the need for extensive protection protocols has been reduced. Sarah leaned closer to the phone. Agent Torres, this is Sarah. Does this mean I could travel to Denver to see my sister? It does, Torres confirmed. In fact, we'd prefer to have you available in Denver for depositions and pretrial meetings. Over the next few weeks, we could arrange for you to stay at a secure facility near the hospital where your sister is being treated. Jake felt his newly declared happiness threatened by the prospect of Sarah leaving, even temporarily. But before he could voice his concerns, Sarah was speaking again. What about bringing my sister here instead? She asked. Dr. Walsh mentioned that a change of environment might benefit Emily's recovery. Montana has excellent medical facilities, and the ranch already has security measures in place. Agent Torres was quiet for a moment, clearly considering the request. That's an interesting proposal, she said finally. Let me discuss it with my supervisors and Dr. Walsh. If everyone agrees it's medically appropriate and we can ensure adequate security, it might actually work better than having you travel back and forth to Denver. After Agent Torres hung up with promises to call back within 24 hours, the family found themselves in a strange state of suspended animation. The possibility of Emily joining them at the ranch was tantalizing, but nothing was certain. Yet, medical evaluations needed to be completed, security protocols needed to be adjusted, and most importantly, Emily herself needed to be consulted about the plan. That evening, after the children were in bed, Jake and Sarah sat on the front porch watching the stars emerge over the Montana mountains. The security cameras and motion sensors were active around them, but for the first time in weeks, Jake felt genuinely peaceful about their safety. Are you sure about this? Sarah asked, breaking the comfortable silence that had settled between them. About Emily coming here, about us, about all of it? Jake reached for her hand, marveling at how natural the gesture had become. I'm sure. About loving you, he said. Everything else we'll figure out as we go. Sarah leaned against his shoulder, her body relaxing into his warmth. I never thought I'd have a family again, she admitted. After Emily was attacked, after I thought she died, I believed that part of my life was over forever. Maybe it was, Jake suggested. Maybe this is something completely new. Not a replacement for what you lost, but something different and unexpected and better than anything you imagined before. Sarah turned to look at him, her eyes reflecting the porch light. Do you really think Emily will fit in here? With Tommy and Lily, with this life we're building? I think, Jake said carefully, that people who've been broken and put themselves back together have a special understanding of what matters. Emily's been through hell, but she survived it. That kind of strength recognizes itself in others. Tommy and Lily have been through their own hell, Sarah observed. Exactly. They'll understand her in ways that other children might not. And she'll understand them. Sometimes the best families are the ones that choose each other rather than the ones that happen by accident. They sat in comfortable silence for a while longer, both lost in thoughts of the future they were contemplating. Jake found himself imagining Emily at the dinner table, contributing her own voice to the conversations that had become so precious to him. He pictured her helping Lily with art projects, perhaps finding her own healing through nurturing relationships with children who needed her as much as she needed them. The possibilities were endless and terrifying and wonderful all at once. Like love itself, he realized. Like every important decision that had the power to transform lives completely. Jake. Sarah's voice was soft in the darkness. When Emily comes here, when we officially become a family, what will we tell people? How do we explain a household with 5 people who aren't related by blood but belong together anyway? Jake smiled at the question, recognizing the practical concerns behind it. Rural Montana communities could be traditional in their understanding of family structures, and their situation would certainly raise eyebrows and questions. We tell them the truth, he said simply, that sometimes the best families are the ones that find each other when they need each other most. That love isn't limited by biology or conventional expectations. That we're exactly where we're supposed to be, with exactly the people we're supposed to be with. Sarah's smile was visible even in the dim light. I like that answer, she said. Good, Jake replied, pressing a kiss to the top of her head. Because it's the only one I've got. Inside the house, they could hear the sounds of children sleeping peacefully, secure in the knowledge that the adults they loved were watching over them. Soon, Jake hoped, there would be another voice added to their nighttime symphony. Another person healing and growing and learning to trust in the safety of unconditional love. The Morrison Ranch was about to become something it had never been before, something bigger and more complex and more beautiful than its original design. Jake couldn't wait to see what it would become. The wedding planning consumed the next 6 weeks in the most delightful way possible. What had started as a simple desire to make their commitment official had blossomed into a celebration that somehow managed to involve half the county. Word had spread through the close-knit Montana community about the rancher who'd found love again and the woman who'd brought healing to his family. And neighbors who'd barely spoken to Jake since Claire's death suddenly appeared with offers to help with everything from catering to decorations. Emily surprised everyone by volunteering to coordinate the details, a task that seemed to energize her in ways her therapy sessions never had. She threw herself into researching flowers and menus with the focused intensity of someone discovering a talent she hadn't known she possessed. Dr. Walsh, during one of their video consultations, noted that event planning was providing Emily with a sense of control and purpose that was accelerating her recovery in unexpected ways. She's becoming the person she was meant to be before the trauma interrupted her development, Dr. Walsh observed. This responsibility is allowing her to reclaim her agency and her joy simultaneously. Tommy had appointed himself as wedding security coordinator, a role that both amused and impressed Agent Torres during her weekly check-ins. The 8-year-old had developed detailed plans for guest screening and perimeter monitoring that showed genuine tactical thinking. Agent Torres had even incorporated some of his suggestions into the official security protocol for the event. Your boy has a real gift for this kind of thinking, she told Jake during one of their meetings. If he maintains this interest as he gets older, the Bureau would be lucky to have him. Jake felt the familiar mixture of pride and concern at the observation. Tommy's intelligence and natural protective instincts were remarkable, but Jake sometimes worried about the cost of his son's premature maturity. The boy who should have been focused on baseball and video games was instead thinking about threat assessment and emergency procedures. Lily, meanwhile, had embraced her role as flower girl with the enthusiasm of someone who'd been waiting her entire 5 years for exactly this opportunity. She spent hours practicing her walk down the aisle, carefully carrying a basket of silk flowers while Sarah and Emily watched with poorly concealed amusement. I'm going to be the most beautiful flower girl ever, Lily announced during one of these practice sessions. And everyone will know that I'm the one who made Daddy and Sarah love each other. How did you make us love each other? Sarah asked, genuinely curious about Lily's 5-year-old logic. I asked you to braid my hair, Lily explained with perfect seriousness. And then Daddy saw how good you were at taking care of me. And that's when he decided to keep you forever. The observation was so astute that both adults exchanged amazed glances over Lily's head. Children saw truth with a clarity that adults often missed, recognizing the moment when casual kindness had transformed into something deeper and more permanent. The legal proceedings in Denver were wrapping up more quickly than anyone had anticipated. Judge Cross's plea bargain had created a domino effect among his co-conspirators, with each arrest leading to new revelations and additional cooperation. Detective Kendrick had proven to be particularly valuable as a witness, his detailed knowledge of the organization's operations helping federal prosecutors build cases that would ensure long prison sentences for everyone involved. It's almost over, Agent Torres informed them during a call 2 weeks before the wedding. The last of the major players was arrested yesterday, and the plea agreements are being finalized. Within a month, Miss Collins will be completely free of any legal obligations related to the case. The news filled Sarah with a relief so profound it left her temporarily speechless. 2 years of running, hiding, looking over her shoulder, and now it was finally ending. She would be free to live openly, to use her real name, to build a future without the constant shadow of the past threatening to destroy everything she loved. What happens to the security measures here? Jake asked, ever practical about the implications for their daily life. Most of them can be removed once the legal proceedings are complete, Torres replied. Though I'd recommend keeping some of the basic monitoring systems. Old habits and all that. Jake found himself reluctant to give up all the security measures, not because he expected continued threats, but because they'd become part of the ranch's character. The cameras and sensors had made everyone feel safer, had given Tommy and Emily particular comfort during their most vulnerable moments. Some changes, once made, became permanent improvements rather than temporary necessities. The wedding dress had been Claire's, altered by a seamstress in Copper Falls to fit Sarah's slider frame. Jake had found it in the attic while looking for Christmas decorations the previous winter, and Emily had immediately declared it perfect when Sarah modeled it hesitantly for the family. Claire would want you to wear it, Emily had said with the intuitive understanding that had become typical of her observations. She'd want to be part of this day somehow. Sarah had been uncertain about wearing another woman's wedding dress, worried about stepping on sacred memories or claiming something that wasn't rightfully hers. But when she saw how happy it made Tommy and Lily to see their mother's dress being honored in this way, she understood that it was exactly right. Claire wasn't being replaced or forgotten. She was being honored and included, made part of the new family story they were writing together. The ceremony itself was planned for the meadow behind the ranch house, with the mountains providing a backdrop that no church could match. Pastor Williams from the community church in Copper Falls would officiate, and the guest list had grown to include neighbors Jake barely knew, but who'd insisted on attending to show their support for the family that had captured the community's collective heart. Frank and Mary Chun had volunteered to handle the catering, refusing to accept payment for what they declared was their contribution to the community celebration. Sheriff Martinez would provide additional security, though he joked that his main job would be crowd control rather than threat prevention. Even Dr. Walsh was flying in from Denver to attend, declaring that she wouldn't miss the chance to see Emily in her new environment. The night before the wedding, Jake found himself standing on the front porch again, looking out over the land that had become so much more than just property over the past months. The security lights illuminated the immediate area around the house, but beyond their reach, the Montana landscape stretched endlessly under a canopy of stars that seemed close enough to touch. Emily joined him on the porch, moving with the confident grace she'd developed since coming to the ranch. Her recovery had been remarkable, but more than that, she'd discovered strengths and capabilities that her trauma had hidden rather than destroyed. The young woman who'd been broken by violence had emerged as someone with deep reserves of compassion and wisdom. Nervous about tomorrow? She asked, settling into the chair beside him. Terrified, Jake admitted honestly. Not about marrying Sarah, but about whether I can be the husband she deserves, the father Tommy and Lily need, the brother-in-law you can count on. Emily considered his words with the careful attention she applied to everything these days. You know, she said finally, I used to think that being strong meant never being afraid, never doubting yourself, never needing help from other people. And now I think being strong means being afraid and doubtful and needy, but choosing to love people anyway. Choosing to build something good even when you're not sure you know how. Jake turned to study Emily's profile in the dim light, struck by the depth of insight in someone who was still recovering from trauma that would have destroyed weaker people. When did you get so wise? Emily's smile was visible even in the darkness. When I realized that the worst thing that could happen to me already had, and I survived it. Everything else is just life being complicated, not life being impossible. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, both lost in thoughts of the journey that had brought them to this moment. Jake thought about the man he'd been 18 months ago, broken by grief and overwhelmed by responsibilities he felt incapable of handling. That man couldn't have imagined the happiness and completeness he felt now. Couldn't have envisioned a family that included people who'd chosen each other rather than being assigned to each other by biology. Jake. Emily's voice was soft in the darkness. Yeah. Thank you for saving my sister. For giving her a place to heal and a reason to hope again. I know the past 2 years were hard for her in ways she hasn't told me about yet. Jake felt his throat tighten with emotion at Emily's gratitude. She saved us, he replied honestly. All of us. I bought her freedom for $100. but she gave us back our lives. $100? Emily's eyebrows rose in surprise. Sarah said it was less, but she never told me the exact amount. $100, Jake confirmed. Best investment I ever made. Emily laughed, a sound of pure joy that had become more frequent as her healing progressed. Wait until I tell her you're inflating the price for dramatic effect. She's going to give you so much grief about that. Let her, Jake said with a grin. I'll happily take grief from her for the rest of my life. The wedding day dawned with the kind of perfect weather that seemed designed by divine intervention for outdoor ceremonies. The temperature was warm but not hot, with a gentle breeze that carried the scent of wildflowers across the meadow where white chairs had been arranged in neat rows facing a simple arch decorated with local blooms. Jake stood at the altar in his best suit, Tommy beside him as best man and ring bearer combined. His son looked serious and proud in his own new suit, the responsibility of his role weighing on him with the gravity he applied to everything important. The guests had assembled with the quiet reverence that Montana communities reserved for truly significant occasions. Jake recognized faces from town, neighboring ranchers he'd known for years, federal agents who'd become friends through shared circumstances, and medical professionals who'd traveled from Denver to witness Emily's triumph. The music began, played by a small ensemble from the Copper Falls Community Band, and Lily appeared at the end of the aisle looking like a princess in her white dress with a crown of baby's breath in her blonde hair. She walked with careful precision, scattering rose petals with the focused concentration of someone performing the most important job of her young life. Emily followed as maid of honor, radiant in a soft blue dress that complemented her coloring and emphasized the health and happiness she'd regained. She moved with confidence now, her smile genuine and bright as she took her place at the altar. Then Sarah appeared, and Jake felt his breath catch in his throat at the sight of her. Claire's wedding dress had been transformed into something uniquely Sarah's through alterations and styling, but it was the expression on Sarah's face that truly took his breath away. She looked radiant with a joy so complete and unguarded that it seemed to illuminate the entire meadow. She walked down the aisle without anyone giving her away, a conscious choice that symbolized her independence and strength. But as she neared the altar, Jake stepped forward to meet her, offering his arm in a gesture that spoke of partnership rather than possession. "You look beautiful," he whispered as she took his arm. "You clean up pretty well yourself, Cowboy," she whispered back, using the nickname that had developed over their months together. Pastor Williams performed the ceremony with warmth and dignity, incorporating elements that honored their unique family situation. When he asked who supported this marriage, the entire congregation rose as one, a show of community approval that brought tears to Sarah's eyes. The vows they'd written themselves were simple but profound, promises to love and protect not just each other, but the family they'd built together. When Jake promised to honor Claire's memory while building new traditions with Sarah, there wasn't a dry eye in the meadow. When Sarah vowed to love Tommy and Lily as her own children while helping Emily continue her healing journey, the emotion in her voice carried across the gathering like a blessing. Tommy presented the rings with the solemnity of someone performing a sacred duty, and Lily beamed with pride when Pastor Williams declared Jake and Sarah husband and wife. The kiss that sealed their marriage was gentle but full of promise, witnessed by mountains and sky and a community that had embraced their unconventional love story. The reception that followed was a true community celebration, with neighbors contributing everything from live music to homemade desserts. Frank Chun had outdone himself with the catering, producing a feast that seemed to appear magically as guests moved from the ceremony site to the larger area behind the barn where tables had been set up under string lights. Jake watched his new wife move through the crowd, accepting congratulations and sharing stories with guests who'd become invested in their family's happiness. Emily was in her element as the unofficial event coordinator, ensuring that everything ran smoothly while clearly enjoying the social interaction that had once been impossible for her. Tommy and Lily had appointed themselves as hosts, introducing Emily to guests and proudly explaining their family's composition to anyone who asked. Their easy acceptance of their expanded family structure seemed to put adults at ease with the unconventional arrangement. "You did good, Morrison," Sheriff Martinez said, joining Jake at the edge of the celebration area. "That woman's going to keep you on your toes." That's the plan, Jake replied, watching Sarah laugh at something Agent Torres had said. Life was getting too predictable. The sheriff chuckled. Somehow I doubt you'll have that problem anymore. As the evening progressed and guests began to depart, Jake found himself reflecting on the journey that had brought them to this moment. A year ago, he'd been a broken widower struggling to raise traumatized children while managing a failing ranch. Tonight, he was surrounded by family and friends, celebrating a love that had healed them all in different ways. The last guests departed just as the mountain stars were becoming visible overhead. Jake and Sarah stood together in the meadow where they'd been married, still in their wedding clothes, but finally alone except for Emily and the children who were cleaning up the last of the decorations. No regrets? Sarah asked, leaning against his side with the comfortable intimacy that had developed between them. Only that it took so long. Jake replied honestly. I wish I'd found you sooner. We found each other exactly when we needed to, Sarah said with the wisdom she'd gained through hardship. Any sooner, and we might not have been ready for this. Jake considered her words, recognizing the truth in them. The man he'd been before Claire's death wouldn't have been capable of the kind of love he felt for Sarah now. The woman Sarah had been before her own trauma wouldn't have understood the depth of healing his family needed. Their love had been forged in the crucible of shared loss and mutual need, making it stronger than anything that had come before. What happens now? Jake asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. Now we live, Sarah said simply. We wake up tomorrow as a married couple with 3 children and a ranch to run and a life to build together. We face whatever comes next as a family. Sounds perfect, Jake said, meaning it completely. Emily appeared beside them, having finished her cleanup duties with characteristic efficiency. I hate to interrupt this romantic moment, she said with a grin. But Lily fell asleep in her flower girl dress and Tommy's nodding off at the kitchen table. Someone needs to get those kids to bed. Jake and Sarah exchanged a look of amused recognition. This was their life now, romantic moments interrupted by practical parenting responsibilities, grand gestures balanced by everyday needs. It was messy and complicated and absolutely perfect. Welcome to married life, Emily said with satisfaction as they headed toward the house together. Hope you're ready for this level of chaos. Bring it on, Jake said, wrapping his arms around both his wife and sister-in-law as they walked. We can handle anything as long as we're together. Inside the house, they found Tommy and Lily exactly as Emily had described, exhausted from the excitement of the day, but too wound up to have gone to bed voluntarily. Jake carried Lily to her room, while Sarah helped Tommy with his bedtime routine. The domestic tasks feeling both familiar and newly significant now that they were legally a family. When the children were finally settled, Jake and Sarah found themselves alone in their bedroom for the first time as husband and wife. The room that had once been Jake's solitary retreat had been gradually transformed over the months into a shared space that reflected both their personalities. Mrs. Morrison, Jake said, testing out the name that was now officially Sarah's. I like the sound of that, Sarah replied, beginning to remove the pins from her hair. Though I think it's going to take some getting used to. Jake moved to help her with the pins, his fingers gentle as he worked through the elaborate style Emily had created for the wedding. We have plenty of time to get used to it, he said. The rest of our lives, in fact. Sarah's hair fell in waves around her shoulders as the last pin was removed, and Jake was struck again by her beauty. Not just physical beauty, though she was certainly that, but the inner radiance that came from someone who'd survived terrible things and chosen love anyway. I love you, he said, the words carrying more weight now that they were married than they had even that morning. I love you too, Sarah replied, turning in his arms to face him fully. All of you. This whole complicated, wonderful family we've built together. Their wedding night was gentle and perfect, a claiming and celebration that felt like both an ending and a beginning. They were no longer two broken people finding solace in each other's company. They were partners now, legally and spiritually bound, ready to face whatever challenges and joys the future might bring. Later, as they lay together in the darkness with Sarah's head on Jake's shoulder, they could hear the sounds of their house settling around them. Emily moving quietly in her room as she prepared for bed, Tommy's steady breathing from across the hall, Lily talking softly to her stuffed animals as she drifted off to sleep. Listen, Sarah whispered into the darkness. To what? Jake asked. To our family, Sarah replied. To the sound of everyone safe and happy in home. Jake listened, hearing what Sarah meant. The quiet sounds of people who belonged together, who'd chosen each other and committed to building something lasting. It was the sound of healing, of hope fulfilled, of love that had proven stronger than trauma and loss. It's beautiful, Jake agreed, pressing a kiss to the top of Sarah's head. Outside, the Montana mountains stood sentinel over the Morrison Ranch, watching over a family that had been broken and made whole again through the simple miracle of people choosing to love each other completely. The ranch that had once echoed with silence and grief now hummed with life and possibility. Jake Morrison had paid $100 at a desperate auction for a woman's freedom. In return, he'd received a wife, a sister-in-law, healing for his children, and a future brighter than anything he'd dared to imagine. It was, by any measure, the bargain of several lifetimes. The mountain cowboy and his bride slept peacefully in each other's arms, surrounded by the family they'd built from the ashes of separate sorrows. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new joys, new opportunities to prove that love could indeed conquer anything when it was patient and strong and true. But tonight, all was well at the Morrison Ranch. All was exactly as it should be. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.